whereby everybody would operate in little cells, either on their own or with just a very few other people. They wouldn't talk about what they were doing with anybody else. So if government informants penetrated any given plot, they could blow up one plot, break up one cell, but the movement as a whole would go forward. And the plan, as far as it is possible to discern, is that there was going to be a generalized uprising. The first thing they were going to target were federal judges, and McVeigh was one of the people who decided, I'm going to be part of this movement. But because of this leaderless resistance concept, he figured out his plan, in isolation. The rest of the movement knew what he was up to. They all talked about this young guy, Sergeant Mac, some of them called him. They knew that he was efficient, they knew that he was a great soldier, they knew that he had a lot of specific knowledge and he was going to do something. They didn't necessarily know what it was. In the run-up to the bombing, because the radical far right are not as disciplined as they might be, a lot of them are socially rather dysfunctional, they talk too much, they're all very paranoid, but with reason to some degree, because there are in fact government informants around who are listening into what they're doing. Little bits and pieces of this generalized plan did leak out, and there were people in the FBI who tracked the radical far right and people in the ATF who were deeply worried, who felt that something was coming. The ATF, by a combination of circumstances, happened to have an undercover informant who penetrated the most dangerous radical community in the country, which was in Oklahoma, in a very remote part of eastern Oklahoma. It's called Elahim City. She started reporting back that there were plans afoot to wage war on the government, that they were talking about blowing up federal buildings, they were talking about assassinations, bombings, shootings, and the rest of it. What did the ATF do with this information? What they should have done is they should have gone to the FBI and said, we're hearing all this alarming stuff, we need to do something about this. Instead of which, their thought was, we screwed up really badly at Ruby Ridge because they were the ones who started that disaster. We screwed up really badly at Waco because they were the ones who started that disaster. If we screw up one more time, we have a Republican majority now in Congress under Newt Gingrich that are openly gunning for us, they want to close us down. If we acknowledge there's a problem here, get into another siege situation and it goes wrong, that's going to be the end of our presidency. So instead we're going to declare that this undercover informant is mentally unstable, we're going to pull her out, we're going to close our ears, we're going to close our eyes and just hope for the best. Then the bomb goes off, and the ATF, the last thing they want to do is admit to the FBI that this is what they did. The FBI finds out that there had been an informant there, go absolutely bananas, and try and get to the bottom of what had happened. But the FBI has its own reasons not to want to go after the radical far right. They were averse at the time to doing anything that smacked of intelligence gathering. They were under strict instructions from the Attorney General. This is going back to Watergate and the Vietnam War, not to do anything that wasn't strictly connected to a criminal investigation. So they knew that they were aware of what was going, that there was a problem in Elahim City, but they had backed off as well. Didn't want to acknowledge that, so they didn't go into Elahim City after the bombing either. This is one of many leads that was not followed, but it was the most glaring one. It turned out McVeigh had made a phone call to Elahim City. There was a great deal of evidence that he'd spent time there. There was a great deal of evidence that he was very familiar with a large cast of radical, dangerous criminals who spent time there. They either lived there or they passed through on a regular basis. A number of them were later arrested and convicted for other violent crimes. But the connection to the Oklahoma City bombing, which at the very least should have been explored thoroughly, was left completely to one side. Layering on top of all of that, just to compound the picture of the federal law enforcement community was in a state of chaos, Louis Freeh, who was the new director of the FBI, he'd come on board after Waco to clean up the act, decided he was going to clean out the FBI of every last division chief and replace them with his own people. And he chose the moment of the Oklahoma City bombing to target the guy who was in charge in Oklahoma, a man by the name of Bob Ricks, who had been a rival of his for the directorship of the FBI. So he thought, now's my chance. So instead of putting Ricks in charge of the investigation, which would have been the logical thing to do, he put someone in over his head. Suddenly the FBI in Oklahoma City is divided right down the middle. No one's talking to anybody else. They don't hate Weldon Kennedy, who's the guy who came in, but they hate everything he represents. They don't want to pass any information on to him. And then he decides after a month, I'm not sticking around in this poison atmosphere. He leaves again. They appoint a new head of the investigation, a man by the name of Danny Deffenbaugh, who is a very honest guy. He's a terrific investigator, but had no managerial experience, no political clout whatsoever, and I think they put him in there deliberately so that he could be manipulated. But as I mentioned earlier, you suddenly started having all these back channels of individual FBI agents talking directly to the federal prosecutors being at war essentially with the FBI. Yes. Yes. I'm going to stop in a second. So, and as time went on, there was a tremendous effort at the beginning, I will keep this brief, to find as many people as possible. They got to McVeigh very quickly for reasons that I won't go into now. They got to Terry Nichols very quickly after that. And then things kind of ground slowly to a halt. They couldn't make any more headway. They couldn't find any more people. And over about a month, the determination was made, we need to make sure we can make the case against McVeigh and Terry Nichols, because it's actually rather a circumstantial case. There are all kinds of holes in it. So instead of all these people who we're looking at as suspects, we're going to start using them as assets for the prosecution instead. They cut deals, they offered immunity, they line people up to be witnesses instead of going after them as possible co-conspirators. And by the end of the summer of 1995, so 3 or 4 months later, they issued the indictment against McVeigh and Nichols, and they cited in there others unknown, which was, that language was the product of a war going on in the prosecution team between those who said, let's pretend no one else is involved, and others who said, no, we have to hold out the possibility that we'll find the others, because we're pretty sure there are others. So they had that language in there, and it was like a promissory note on future investigation, and that future investigation never occurred. And there was, it was dysfunction from there on. Unfortunately, at trial, which would have been the best point to expose all of this, during McVeigh's trial, the defense team really fell down on the job. The main defense lawyer did a really horrible job of poking holes in the government's defense. If they defended McVeigh like they defended O.J. Simpson, and just wait for the government's case to collapse by itself, they might have had a pretty good chance of success. Instead, the lawyer was really not in good communication with McVeigh. He had no coherent strategy, and the death penalty was the result. The Nichols trial went rather differently. He had a brilliant team of lawyers, and he did not get the death penalty, and the government was embarrassed repeatedly over many of the things that they had done wrong. Unfortunately, the media's attention at that point had drifted away, and we never really heard about it. So that's really, in a nutshell, the government side of the story. There's also a tremendous cast of characters, and this is a segue into Todd's reading, tremendous cast of characters on the radical far right itself, people who were in and around Elohim City. One character who Todd's going to talk about is a German national by the name of Andreas Strassmayer. For years nobody could figure out who he was or what he was doing there. His father was a prominent politician in Germany, helped with the reunification of Germany. His grandfather had been a very prominent Nazi, and so no one was quite sure, was he a true believer, was he a Nazi himself, or was he some kind of government agent who had penetrated the community and was reporting to someone? Who knows? The Americans, the Germans, the Israelis, there are various theories out there. I talked to him for about 4 days and came to the conclusion that really the best way to understand him is the Oklahoma City version of the bin Laden family. That he was somebody who had political clout, who had a lot of political shits he could cash in, and instead of questioning him and quizzing him, as Danny Defenbaugh, the head of the investigation, badly wanted to do, he was allowed to leave the country. Unlike the bin Laden family who were put on a plane and flown out, his exodus from the United States was a really colourful affair. He was friends, or thought he was friends, with the neo-Nazi equivalent of the ACLU, this legal outfit called the Cause Foundation, run by a man by Kirk Lyons, and his number 2, whose name was Dave Holloway, whose business was to keep these people basically out of too much trouble. I think the reason they were allowed to operate and weren't broken up by the government is there was an understanding. If you stop these people from being complete idiots, we'll tolerate you defending the Ku Klux Klan's right to march in Pulaski, Tennessee every year, and various other things that they like to do. And as you're about to hear from Todd, at the moment when it became clear that Andreas Strassmayer had to leave, Kirk Lyons and Dave Holloway were hosting him in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and they decided he had to leave in a hurry. And it's one of these crazy stories that gives you a flavor of the kind of people that I've been spending the last 4 years of my